The wind howled like a banshee across the desolate plains, whipping dust into a frenzy that stung Abigail's eyes. Her small, calloused hands trembled as she clutched the worn reins of her mare, a sturdy but weary animal named Daisy. Before her, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky, was the smouldering ruin of what had once been her home. The cabin, her sanctuary, her late husband's legacy, was reduced to a skeletal frame of blackened timbers, still weeping plumes of acrid smoke. "Fill every part of me before the flames do," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, a desperate plea to an indifferent universe. It had been a brutal winter, and the blizzard had descended with a ferocity that had caught them unprepared. Her husband, John, had been out checking the traps, a routine he'd never missed. He hadn't returned. The fire, a cruel consequence of a fallen, sparking lantern in the storm's fury, had consumed the cabin and, she feared, everything inside. Tears, hot and bitter, finally broke free, tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. Abigail, a woman forged in the crucible of hardship, had always prided herself on her resilience. But this felt like the final, crushing blow. She had nothing left. No home, no John, and a gnawing emptiness that echoed the desolate landscape around her. Daisy whickered softly, nudging Abigail's shoulder as if offering silent comfort. Abigail leaned her forehead against the mare's warm flank, drawing strength from the familiar living presence. She had to survive. For John. For herself. The first stars began to prick the darkening sky, cold and distant witnesses to her solitary grief. The air, though frigid, still held the oppressive warmth of the fire, a constant grim reminder of her loss. She knew she couldn't stay here, amidst the ashes. Survival demanded movement, a desperate scramble for whatever lay beyond the immediate desolation. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her strength, Abigail gathered her resolve. She turned Daisy away from the wreckage and urged her mare forward, into the unknown darkness. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and gnawing hunger. Abigail pushed herself and Daisy onward, driven by an instinct for self-preservation that warred with her profound weariness. The desolate landscape offered little solace, only endless miles of scrub brush, unforgiving rock, and the biting wind that seemed to strip away any remaining warmth. Each jolt of Daisy's gait sent tremors of pain through her aching body, a constant thrumming reminder of her vulnerability. She rationed the meager supplies she'd managed to salvage from her saddlebags, a half-eaten biscuit, a few dried apples, and a water skin that felt pathetically light. The silence was a heavy blanket, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of Daisy's hooves and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Abigail found herself talking to Daisy, her voice a raspy murmur, sharing her fears, her memories of John, and her desperate hope for a sign of civilization, as dawn painted the eastern horizon in hues of rose and gold. Casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, Abigail spotted something in the distance. A faint trail, more a suggestion than a defined path, snaked its way across a low rise. Hope, a fragile butterfly, fluttered in her chest. She nudged Daisy towards it, her heart quickening. It was then that she saw it. A lone rider, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of long hours in the saddle. He was some distance away, but Abigail felt an instinctive prickle of unease. The West was a dangerous place, and she was a solitary woman, vulnerable and alone. She pulled Daisy to a halt, her hand instinctively going to the small, tarnished locket she wore around her neck, a keepsake from John. The rider continued his approach, his posture relaxed but alert. As he drew closer, Abigail could make out the details. A weathered face, a dark hat pulled low, and a rifle slung across his back. He was a man of the frontier, rugged and self-sufficient. He reined in his horse a few yards away, his gaze assessing, neither overtly friendly nor hostile. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, met hers, and for a fleeting moment, Abigail felt a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "Lost, ma'am?" His voice was deep, with a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the vastness of the land. Abigail, her voice raspy, managed a response. I'm not sure where I am. My cabin burned down." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight softening. A shame. That's a hard way to lose your home. He looked at her, taking in her worn clothes and weary demeanor. Name's Silas Blackwood. Abigail hesitated for a moment, then offered, Abigail Carter." Silas nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Well, Abigail Carter, this trail leads to a small settlement, a few days' ride east. Not much, but it's got a saloon and a general store. You look like you could use a warm meal and a roof over your head." The offer, so straightforward, so unexpected, settled Abigail's apprehension. There was a quiet steadiness about Silas Blackwood that felt dependable. "That would be a blessing, Silas," she replied, the words heavy with gratitude. The settlement of Havenwood was less a town and more a collection of weathered structures huddled together against the elements. A general store with a faded sign, a saloon whose swinging doors seemed to perpetually promise refuge and revelry, a blacksmith's forge, and a handful of small cabins formed its entirety. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, horses, and the faint, ever-present aroma of stale beer from the saloon. Silas led Abigail to the general store, a bustling hub of activity. Mrs. Gable, the proprietress, a woman with a kind face and hands roughened by years of work, greeted them warmly. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of concern as she took in Abigail's disheveled state. "Silas, who's this you've brought?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice gentle. "Abigail Carter, Martha. Her cabin burned down in the storm," Silas explained, his tone matter-of-fact. Mrs. Gable's brow furrowed with sympathy. "Oh, my dear, that's terrible. Come, sit by the stove. I'll fetch you some warm broth." As Abigail gratefully sank onto a stool near the crackling fire, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The simple act of kindness, of being seen and acknowledged, was a balm to her raw nerves. Silas, meanwhile, spoke quietly with Mrs. Gable, his words a low murmur that Abigail couldn't quite decipher. He then purchased a few provisions for her, flour, salt, some dried beans, and a small tin of coffee. "Just enough to get you by for a few days," he said, handing her the bag. "Martha here can help you find a place to stay. I've got some business to attend to." He hesitated, his gaze lingering on Abigail for a moment. "I'll check in on you tomorrow." And with a nod, he was gone, leaving Abigail with a curious mixture of gratitude and an unanswered question about the man's quiet intensity. Mrs. Gable proved to be a godsend. She led Abigail to a small, unoccupied cabin behind the store, a basic but clean structure that offered a welcome respite. "It's not much, but it's dry and safe," she said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You rest, dear, and if you need anything at all, you just come to me." That evening, as Abigail sat by the meager fire in her new temporary home, the broth warming her from the inside out, she reflected on the events of the past few days. The loss of her home and the fear for John's fate were still heavy burdens, but the unexpected kindness of Silas and Mrs. Gable had chipped away at the despair. Havenwood, with its rough edges and simple folk, felt like a sanctuary. The next morning Silas reappeared as he had promised. He brought with him a small sack of potatoes and a side of smoked bacon, a generous offering that brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Just trying to be neighborly," he said, his voice gruff but with an underlying warmth. He didn't pry, didn't ask too many questions about John. He simply offered his presence, a steady, quiet support. Over the next few days, Abigail slowly began to rebuild. She cleaned the cabin, mended her clothes, and started a small garden patch behind the structure. Silas would often stop by, offering a helping hand, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence, his presence a comforting anchor. He spoke little of himself, but Abigail learned that he was a trapper and hunter, a man who knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. There was a quiet strength about him, a self-reliance that she found herself admiring, yet a shadow lingered over Havenwood. Whispers circulated among the townsfolk, hushed conversations that ceased whenever Abigail drew near. She noticed furtive glances, the way people would sometimes stop talking abruptly when she entered the general store. It was a palpable tension, a sense of unease that clung to the settlement like the prairie dust. Silas, too, seemed to sense it, his gaze often sweeping the surrounding landscape with a vigilance that spoke of more than just the usual dangers of the frontier. The unease in Havenwood was a subtle but persistent current, like a hidden undertow pulling at the fragile peace. Abigail, though trying to focus on her own rebuilding, couldn't ignore it. She saw it in the worried glances exchanged between townsfolk, in the hushed tones of conversations that would abruptly cease. The men in the saloon seemed to cast more wary eyes towards the windows, and the women often walked in pairs when venturing out. One afternoon, as Abigail was tending to her nascent garden, Jed, the town's grizzled blacksmith, stopped by. He was a man of few words, his hands permanently stained with soot and his face etched with the harshness of his trade. He leaned against the fence, his gaze fixed on the distant rolling hills. "Storms ain't always made of wind and snow, Abigail," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. Abigail looked up, her trowel still in her hand. "What do you mean, Jed?" He spat on the ground. "Trouble's brewing. Shadows moving out there. Ain't natural." "Shadows?" Abigail repeated, a chill creeping up her spine. "What kind of shadows?" Jed shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "Strangers. Not the usual kind. They don't belong, looking for something." He glanced at Silas, who had just arrived, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Silas knows." Silas approached, his expression serious. "Jed's right, Abigail. There have been reports. Cattle rustlers, yes, but something more organized. Someone's been pushing further west than usual, and they're not friendly." "Who are they?" Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Hard to say for sure," Silas replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But they've got a reputation for being ruthless. They call themselves the Iron Hand." The name itself sent a shiver down Abigail's spine. It conjured images of an unyielding, oppressive force. What do they want? Land, most likely. Or whatever valuable lies beneath it, Silas said grimly. "They push people out, take what they want. Havenwood's been too quiet for too long. We're on their radar." The revelation cast a pall over Abigail's fragile hope. Her own personal tragedy had brought her to this place seeking solace, but now she found herself in the midst of a potential conflict. She thought of John, his dreams of a peaceful life, of building something lasting. The idea of this Iron Hand group threatening the nascent community, the very people who had shown her kindness, ignited a spark of defiance within her. That evening at the saloon, the usual boisterous atmosphere was subdued. The men gathered, their faces grim, discussing the rumors. Silas was among them, his presence a quiet assurance. Abigail, feeling a newfound sense of belonging, though still reeling from her own losses, found herself drawn to the heart of the community. "We can't just sit here and wait," a voice called out from the back of the saloon. It was a grizzled prospector named Old Man Hemlock, known for his sharp eyes and sharper tongue. "We need to be prepared." Silas stood up, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Hemlock's right. We're not going to let them push us around. We'll form a watch. Anyone who can shoot, anyone who can help, we need you." Abigail, her heart pounding, stepped forward. "I can shoot," she declared, her voice surprisingly steady. "And I can help with whatever else needs doing." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd, followed by a chorus of nods. The community, bound by shared fear and a burgeoning sense of unity, began to rally. Abigail, a widow who had lost everything, found a new purpose, a new fight to engage in, one that wasn't just about her own survival, but about protecting the fragile haven that had offered her refuge. The formation of a community watch brought a sense of purpose to Havenwood, but it also amplified the underlying fear. Men took turns patrolling the perimeter, their eyes scanning the dark expanse of the prairie, straining to catch the faintest sign of movement. Abigail, despite her own grief, found a grim satisfaction in contributing. She practiced with the rifle Silas had lent her, her aim growing steadier with each shot. The discipline of the drills, the shared vigilance, created a bond among the townsfolk that transcended their individual worries. During one of Silas's patrols, he encountered a lone rider, a man on a lathered horse, heading towards Havenwood in haste. The man, a scout from a neighboring ranch, brought grim news. A small group of riders, bearing the insignia of the Iron Hand, a clenched fist carved into an iron disc, had been spotted scouting the area just a day's ride to the west. They were moving slowly, deliberately, as if assessing their target. Silas returned to Havenwood, his face etched with concern. He gathered the men, including Abigail, at the saloon. "They're coming," he announced, his voice low and serious. "We need to be ready. We've got maybe a day at most before they reach us." A wave of fear washed over the gathered townsfolk, but it was tempered by a resolve forged in recent days. Jed, the blacksmith, announced he would reinforce the saloon doors and windows. Martha Gable, despite her gentle demeanor, declared she would tend to the wounded and that the women would help prepare bandages and supplies. Abigail felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but she also felt a surge of determination. She thought of John, of the life they had planned. She wouldn't let some ruthless bandits shatter the peace of this place. As Silas spoke of defensive strategies, his gaze met Abigail's across the room. In that shared look, amidst the palpable tension, a silent understanding passed between them. It was a look that acknowledged the danger, but also a burgeoning respect, perhaps something more that had grown between them in the quiet days of shared hardship and burgeoning hope. As the night wore on, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Abigail found herself walking with Silas outside the saloon, the stars a distant, indifferent audience to their plight. "You're brave, Abigail," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "to face this after what you've been through." Abigail looked at him, her heart a confused mix of fear and a strange, burgeoning warmth. I don't want to lose what little I've found here, and I won't let them take it from anyone else." Silas reached out, his rough fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a brief, almost hesitant gesture, yet it sent a jolt through Abigail. "We'll stand together," he promised, his storm cloud eyes holding hers. "Whatever comes." But even as hope flickered in the shared resolve, a shadow of doubt lingered. The Iron Hand was known for its ruthlessness. Could a small ragtag settlement truly stand against them? And in the midst of this looming conflict, Abigail couldn't shake the lingering question of John. Was he truly gone? Or was there a sliver of hope, a chance he had survived the storm and fire, lost but alive somewhere in the vast wilderness? The thought was a dangerous indulgence, a temptation to cling to a past that was likely extinguished. Yet it persisted, a quiet counterpoint to the immediate threat. The dawn broke, not with the gentle hues of redemption, but with the stark, unforgiving light of impending conflict. The air in Havenwood was thick with a preternatural stillness, broken only by the nervous whinny of a horse or the hushed, urgent whispers of the townsfolk. Abigail, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands, stood beside Silas outside the general store, her gaze fixed on the western horizon. The first sign of their arrival was not a thunder of hooves, but a subtle shift in the landscape, a distant shimmer, a distortion in the heat haze that suggested movement. Then the riders appeared, a dark, menacing wave cresting the rolling hills. There were perhaps 20 of them, their horses lean and powerful, their bodies clad in dark, utilitarian clothing. On their chests, glinting dully in the sun, were the iron discs bearing the symbol of the Iron Hand. A low murmur of fear rippled through Havenwood. Silas's voice, though calm, was taut with urgency. "Positions, everyone. Remember the plan." The townsfolk, armed with a motley collection of rifles, shotguns, and even a few pitchforks, took up their defensive positions behind makeshift barricades of overturned wagons and piled lumber. Abigail found herself positioned near Silas, the shared space offering a fragile sense of security. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching silence. The Iron Hand riders fanned out, their movements coordinated and professional. They didn't charge headlong. Instead, they began to circle the settlement, their actions designed to intimidate and probe. A single shot rang out, not from the attackers, but from Old Man Hemlock, who had positioned himself on the roof of the saloon. It was a warning, a declaration of defiance. The response was immediate and brutal. A volley of shots erupted from the Iron Hand riders, tearing into the flimsy structures of Havenwood. Abigail ducked behind a sturdy wooden barrel, the crack of gunfire deafening, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Dust and splinters flew as bullets ricocheted off wood and stone. "Stay down, Abigail!" Silas yelled, his voice strained. He fired his rifle with practiced precision, aiming at the advancing riders. Abigail, her hands slick with sweat, reloaded her rifle, her movements clumsy with adrenaline. She saw Jed, the blacksmith, bravely holding his ground at the general store entrance, his hammer a formidable weapon. She saw Martha Gable, her face pale but resolute, bandaging a wounded man near the saloon. The fear was real, visceral, but so was the fierce determination of these people. The Iron Hand riders pressed their attack, their goal clearly to sow chaos and fear. One of the riders, a hulking man with a scarred face, broke from the main group and charged towards Abigail's position. His rifle was raised, aimed directly at her. Time seemed to slow. Abigail squeezed the trigger, her shot going wide as the rider's horse reared. He let out a guttural yell and swung his rifle, aiming to crush her. Just as the rifle came down, Silas was there. With a roar, he tackled the rider from his horse, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Abigail scrambled to her feet, her own rifle now trained on the downed attacker. But Silas was already on him, disarming him with swift, brutal efficiency. The fight was far from over. The Iron Hand riders continued their relentless assault, their superior numbers and training beginning to take their toll. Havenwood, a symbol of hope and resilience, was under siege, its inhabitants fighting for their very survival against a tide of brutal ambition. The exchange of gunfire intensified, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the cries of the wounded. The Iron Hand, despite their initial professional approach, were beginning to show their true colors, a ruthless desire to break the spirit of Havenwood. They focused their fire on strategic points, aiming to disable the defenders and sow panic. Abigail, her hands still trembling but her aim now steady, fired with grim determination. She saw Silas fighting like a lion, his movements precise and deadly, protecting the townsfolk. He seemed to be everywhere at once, a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. The shared danger had forged a potent bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. Jed, the blacksmith, was a force of nature at the general store, his hammer ringing against metal and bone as he repelled several attackers trying to breach the reinforced doors. Martha Gable, despite the chaos, continued her work with unwavering calm, her hands tending to the wounded, her quiet presence a beacon of hope amidst the bloodshed. However, the Iron Hand's numerical advantage was becoming increasingly evident. They managed to flank a group of defenders near the saloon, forcing them to retreat. The scarred rider, whom Silas had subdued, had managed to escape during the confusion and was now leading a small contingent towards the small cluster of cabins where Abigail had first found refuge. "Abigail! They're going for the cabins!" Silas shouted, his voice hoarse. "We need to fall back!" Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. Those cabins, though modest, represented safety and a new beginning for many, including herself. Without a word, she and Silas broke from their position, sprinting towards the cabins, hoping to intercept the attackers. As they neared, they saw the scarred rider and his men dismounting, their intentions clear. Abigail raised her rifle, but before she could fire, a figure emerged from one of the cabins. It was Old Man Hemlock, not with a rifle but with a pitchfork, his eyes blazing with a fury that belied his age. He charged the riders, a defiant, almost suicidal act. The distraction was enough. Abigail and Silas opened fire, their shots finding their mark. The scarred rider roared in pain as a bullet grazed his arm. The brief, desperate stand of Hemlock bought them precious seconds. Silas, with a surge of adrenaline, engaged the remaining riders while Abigail focused on the scarred man. The fight was brutal and personal. Abigail, fueled by a primal instinct to protect, found a strength she never knew she possessed. She dodged the scarred rider's wild swings, her rifle now a blunt instrument of defense. In a desperate maneuver, she used the rifle stock to knock his weapon aside, then lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. Silas, having dealt with the other riders, rushed to her aid, disarming the struggling man. The tide had turned. Seeing their leader subdued and their ranks depleted, the remaining Iron Hand riders hesitated. Silas, his chest heaving, stood over the fallen attackers. "You've made your last move," he declared, his voice resonating with authority. "Surrender or face the consequences." With no other choice, the remaining Iron Hand riders threw down their weapons. The silence that followed the cessation of gunfire was deafening, broken only by the moans of the injured and the ragged breaths of the defenders. Havenwood had held. It had bled. It had suffered, but it had held. The aftermath of the battle was a somber affair. The wounded were tended to, the dead mourned, and the damage assessed. Havenwood, though victorious, bore the visible scars of the Iron Hand's aggression. Bullet holes peppered the buildings, and the air hung heavy with the lingering scent of gunpowder and loss. Abigail, exhausted but alive, felt a profound sense of relief mingled with a lingering shock. She had faced death and emerged not unscathed, but stronger. She saw Silas moving among the townsfolk, his presence a source of quiet reassurance, his own wounds, though not visible, clearly weighing on him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ravaged settlement, Silas found Abigail sitting by the smouldering remains of a small overturned wagon. She stared into the embers, her gaze distant. "You did good, Abigail," Silas said softly, sitting down beside her. "You fought like you were born to it." Abigail managed a weak smile. I couldn't let them win. Not here." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and unspoken emotion. "Thank you, Silas, for everything." He met her gaze, his storm-cloud eyes holding a warmth that had been absent before. "We stood together. That's what matters." He hesitated, then with a rare vulnerability added, "I was worried about you." The simple admission, so understated, resonated deeply within Abigail. In the crucible of battle, their connection had deepened, forged in shared fear and mutual reliance. It was more than just gratitude. It was a burgeoning hope, a flicker of something that felt akin to love, blooming in the ashes of her past. The captured Iron Hand riders were bound and guarded, their fate to be decided by the community. Their defeat had not only saved Havenwood, but had also sent a clear message to any who would threaten the peace of the frontier. Jed, his face smudged with soot but his eyes bright, declared, "They won't be bothering anyone around here again." In the days that followed, the process of rebuilding began. The townsfolk, their spirits bruised but not broken, worked together to repair the damage. Abigail, her own cabin still a distant memory, threw herself into the collective effort, her hands busy, her mind slowly beginning to accept the reality of her loss and the possibility of a new future. And then, a flicker of what she had desperately suppressed, a desperate hope for John, resurfaced. A traveling merchant passing through Havenwood mentioned a trapper he'd encountered several weeks prior, many days west, near the Serpent's Pass. The description, though vague, sounded strikingly like John. His build, the distinctive way he carried himself. The merchant had spoken of the man being disoriented, suffering from exposure, but alive. The news was a jolt, a terrifying possibility that sent her heart into a frantic rhythm. Could it be? Was John, her John, still out there? Silas, sensing her turmoil, listened patiently as she recounted the merchant's words. "It's a long shot, Abigail," he said gently, "but if there's a chance, you have to take it." Abigail looked at him, torn. The thought of leaving Havenwood, of leaving Silas, was painful. But the possibility of finding John, of a life that might still be possible, was a siren call she couldn't ignore. The decision to leave weighed on Abigail. Stay in Havenwood and have safety and community, and the hope of a connection with Silas, or leave and chase the ghost of a possibility that John might still be alive. The pull of her past was too strong. Silas, understanding her conflict, offered to go with her. "It's no place for a woman to travel alone," he said. Abigail's heart ached at his selfless offer. "You don't have to say anything," he replied to her silence. "Just know that I'll be there." They journeyed for days, the vast silence of the wilderness, a stark contrast to Havenwood. The unspoken fear that they were chasing a phantom hung heavy between them, yet a quiet connection grew between them, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings that had blossomed. As they neared Serpent's Pass, the terrain became more treacherous. One afternoon, Silas reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the rocks ahead. He found a tattered piece of John's jacket. A wave of despair washed over Abigail. Had she been chasing a ghost? "We don't know for sure," Silas said, gently taking her hand. "But we're here. We'll keep looking." The discovery of the fabric was a turning point. For days they scoured the area, but found no other trace. The wilderness offered only silence, and Abigail's spirit began to falter. She realized the ghost she had been chasing was just that, a ghost. One evening, by the campfire, she looked at Silas, her constant, comforting anchor. "I think it's time to go back," she said, her voice thick with tears. Silas simply nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand." The journey back was quieter, more somber. The hope of finding John had faded, replaced by the reality of his absence. Yet, a new bond had formed between Abigail and Silas. She found herself admiring his strength and quiet resilience. He represented a new beginning. When they returned to Havenwood, the townsfolk greeted them with relief. The question of Abigail's future loomed. One evening, Silas turned to her. "Havenwood is your home now," he said, his voice low and earnest. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to be a part of it with you." Abigail's heart swelled. She thought of the words she had spoken at the ashes of her cabin. "Fill every part of me before the flames do." The flames of loss had consumed much, but a different kind of warmth was beginning to fill the emptiness. She reached out and took his hand. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." The embers of despair had long since cooled, replaced by the steady glow of a future built on courage, resilience, and a love that had found its footing amidst the trials of the Old West. The story of Abigail Carter was not one of defeat, but of a profound and enduring triumph.